I want to introduce our next speaker. Surveying recent publications by Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, and George Will and Patrick Deneen and Jonah Goldberg and Roger Scruton, we have in the last year a real embarrassment of riches when it comes to conservative books. There's a tremendous intellectual energy on the right now, with real debates, consequential debates, between rival visions of the conservative future. These are important. I think there are important things to learn from each of these books. But it was Yoram Hazony's breakout book, The Virtue of Nationalism, the book that provoked debate on television, in news media, in intellectual journals throughout the world. It was this book, with its essentially Hebraic argument about the good of nations, constituted by shared loves and loyalty. It was this book that received the 2019 Conservative Book of the Year from the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Yoram Hazony is a bold thinker, a great friend of Tikva and the Jewish Leadership Conference, and it's my honor to welcome him to the stage.
Thank you, John, Eric, Roger, and the rest of the Tikva family. It's a great honor to be here. All right, look, I've been asked to speak about Israel's place among the nations, and this is, in fact, a topic on which I've spoken many times, and some of you have probably heard me on the subject. But I have a surprise for you today. For once, I'm going to give an optimistic speech. Right now, everybody understands that optimism in today's day and age is a risky business. It's much easier to just be pessimistic. There's plenty of material to use. So we'll start with the background. In recent decades, as you know, American and European elites have devoted themselves to the project of rethinking society from scratch. What were once linchpin concepts such as God and Scripture, nation and family, man and woman, the honorable and the sacred, have been found wanting and severely damaged, if not overthrown, throughout the democratic nations in the West. In 2016, this great continuous revolution, eating away at the foundations of Western nations, has reached the point of crisis. In the United States and the UK, the political assumptions that held the people loyal to their governments have been cast to the wind, and a brutal power struggle has paralyzed the governments of the leading democratic nations for more than 3 years, as Brits and Americans have struggled to roll back the worst failures of Enlightenment liberalism. For the first time in our lives, the internal cohesion of these great nations is so much in doubt that resistance, secession, and even civil war are discussed in all seriousness, usually under the surface, but sometimes not, virtually everywhere. How's that for optimism? But when we think about Israel against this astonishing backdrop of political hardship, uncertainty, and chaos, when we think about Israel, we actually get to see something that's quite astonishing. Israel continues to grow in almost every dimension. For the first time, Israel is exporting energy. For the first time, Israel is exporting water. The tsunami of economic disaster that visited America and Europe left Israel largely untouched, and it continues to grow economically. Israel today maintains the best of relations that it has ever had, not only with the United States, but with Russia, India, China, the Arab world, Brazil, and much of Africa. Israel is a demographic wonder. The rate of Jewish childbirth growing every single year, meaning fertility has been going up every single year for 20 years, to the point where at this point the Jewish birth rate in Israel is roughly double what it is in most Western democratic countries. And it continues to go up. Now, I don't mean to say that everything is great about Israel, that everything's perfect about Israel. You may have noticed that Israel, too, is having some difficulties determining who its government is. And yet, despite the problems, for the first time in our lives, we can honestly say that in comparison with what's happening in America and in Britain and the rest of the Western world, Israel is a rock of stability and sanity. Now, well, wait, let me say that again because it's just so completely implausible. For the first time in our lives, we can honestly say that in comparison with what's happening in America and the West, Israel is a rock of stability and sanity. What an unbelievable achievement this is. All right? I mean, even if it goes south a little bit down the road, today this is true. What an unbelievable achievement this is. And we should stop and ask ourselves, what are the causes of this achievement? What has Israel got that America and the UK and most of the European countries don't have? All right, now, there are many possible answers to this, but I'm just going to give you one to think about. What Israel's got that the rest of these countries don't have is that Israel is a conservative democracy. Right? That Israel is based on its conservatism. Malcolm said, we look to our past in order to know what our future is. Another way of saying that is that we're conservatives. Now let's be very, very careful about this. Because people tend to think, it's very often American liberal Democrats like to say, Israel is a liberal democracy. Just like the socialists used to say that Israel's a socialist state. But Israel was always a conservative state. Right? The great Israeli historian Yaakov Talmon once gave a speech in front of the Conservative Party in the UK, and he had to admit, he said that the truth is that in Israel all the major parties are conservative parties. What he was thinking about was precisely these socialists, the socialism of David Ben-Gurion and Mapai of that generation. That socialism, well, we're all familiar with what was wrong with it, and many of us continue to live under some of the consequences of living under that kind of regime. But it was the labor Zionists who made the Sabbath a weekly holiday. It was the labor Zionists who made learning Bible a requirement of every Jewish child in the Israeli school system. It was the labor Zionists who made kashrut, keeping the laws of dietary observance and reading from the Torah, an integral part, a legally required part of the Israeli armed forces and the functioning of the Israeli government. Israel always was, in very important ways, a conservative society. Let's think of a couple more. Israel's entire political strategic worldview is based on principles that are drawn from the prophets, and consciously so. And this is true whether it's left or right. The principle of kibbutz galuyot, of the ingathering of exiles, the national project of continuing to bring more and more and more Jews from every corner of the world, is a biblical principle which all Israeli political parties have engaged in and supported since the founding of the state. Making the desert bloom, lefrichet hashmama, is a biblical, prophetic principle which every political party has supported. Right? And you can keep going. Let me keep going. Let me just name a couple more things. The revival of Hebrew. The revival of Hebrew is the most conservative enterprise that any nation has ever undertaken. I mentioned Bible in the schools. I mentioned the ingathering of exiles. You may have problems with Orthodox marriage services in Israel, but that's because Israel's a conservative democracy. Required military service, still today, because Israel is a conservative democracy. Holocaust and memorial days for soldiers, well, it's true you have them in many countries, but you don't have them like you have them in Israel. where everybody in the country stops on the streets in order to pay their respects to their fallen friends and relatives. The Jewish state law that people complain about, a constitutional revision in order to make sure that Israel remains a nation state of the Jewish people. People in the West don't like it, but Israelis love it because it's a conservative democracy. Right? We can go on and on. In the state of Israel, celebrating Passover, going to the mikveh, saying Kiddush on Friday night, are part of the national culture. The great majority of Israelis do them, whether or not they see themselves as religious, whether or not they keep the Sabbath. There's a big difference between a liberal democracy and a conservative democracy. A conservative democracy is a country that looks to its past in order to understand that if it's not able to keep its past held in place, then it doesn't know where it's going to go in the future. It's the past that gives us the direction. Now, when we think about Israel's place among the nations, we take our cues also from the Bible, right? Because we have a guiding principle, just like the other ones that we mentioned. We have a guiding principle in Israel of what Israel's place among the nations is supposed to be. And it comes from Scripture. It comes from Isaiah. V'na'aru elav kol hagoyim. V'alchu amim rabim v'amru lechu v'na'aleh el har Adonai el beit Eloi Yaakov v'yorenu midrachav v'nelecha be'ochotav ki mitzion tetzeh Torah u'dvar Adonai miYerushalayim. Isaiah says that in the later days, and it's pretty later now, that Israel will be raised up among the nations in terms of its prestige, and the nations will flow to it, he says. And many peoples will come and say, come, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths, for out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And the prophets of Israel, of course, they're Jews, so they disagree about many things. But on this, they do not disagree. Jeremiah, probably the greatest of the prophets since Moses, has the same view as Isaiah. Elecha goyim yavo me'afsei aretz v'yomru ach sheker nachlu avotenu hevel ve'en ba mo'il. Jeremiah says, nations are going to stream from the ends of the earth. And they'll say, nothing but unreliable things did we receive from our forefathers, the transient and things that aren't productive. Let's learn from the God of Israel. Let's learn from the Jews. Zechariah says, Ko amar Adonai tzvaot. Thus says the Lord of hosts, Bayamim hahem asher yechazeku asara anashim mikol halashonot hagoyim. In those days, 10 men from all the languages of the earth will grab onto vechazeku b'knaf ish yudi, and they'll grab onto the garment of a Jewish person. Lemor nelecha imachem, we will go with you. Ki shamanu Elohim imachem, because we heard that God is with you. And it goes on and on and on. Our scripture, our political tradition, is one that consistently holds up this impossible standard, that this little people is supposed to draw the respect of the nations. We're not supposed to conquer the nations. We're not supposed to impose our law on the nations. But we didn't have Moses speak to the creator of heaven and earth for nothing. We do know a thing or two. And the place of the Jewish people in the eyes of Jewish tradition is to teach the world, Mamlechet Kohanim, to be a nation of priests, that is to be priests to the nations. And on this point, I have to admit that I have given some very bitter speeches over the years. Just this week, I went back and I read a speech that I gave in 2012 when my book, The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture, came out. And I said then, and this part's still true, that the teachings of the Enlightenment liberalism, had smashed the standing of our God in our Scripture. That in America, the Bible had been erased from the schools and is reviled in the universities. I wrote, quote, "Where do we find a glimmer of hope that the teachings of the Jews will gain a respect and a standing again in this crazy world?" And even that was 7 years ago, these words of the prophets that the mighty nations of the earth would turn to Israel for instruction seem to be as far from us as the farthest star. But now I have to make another admission here. My utter ignorance of the things taking place under the surface in those days when I gave all those speeches seems to have annoyed someone upstairs. And what happens next is something like out of Agadah, the rabbinic legends. You can almost hear the conversation taking place in the heavenly court in which the angels approach the Holy One, blessed be He, and say, "Who is this Hazony character and why is he such a nudnik? Let's teach him a lesson." And so shortly after the publication of The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture, I was approached by an older Christian pastor, just to make the dramatic scene as dramatic as possible, was actually wearing long flowing robes, just like to make it out of a movie. And he came and found me in Israel, and he said he had read my book and that he wanted to talk to me. And at that point, I had had very little professional contact with Christians, which has since been changed dramatically. And here's roughly what he said. What he said was, the Christian world is in crisis. All denominations across the boards, including the evangelicals, including the Catholics, including the Orthodox. And what the crisis is about, he said, is that we have lost the ability to defend the Old Testament. And because we he said, I know how to teach the Gospels. I can do that fine. But the attacks on Christianity coming from liberal enlightenment aren't against the Gospels. The attacks on Christianity are focused almost entirely on the Old Testament. And when I read the Old Testament, in fact, when my students come and ask me about the Old Testament, when my parishioners come and ask me about the Old Testament, what am I supposed to say? They ask me all these reasonable questions. This God of anger and God of violence and the return to the land. Well, what difference does a particular land make? And the singling out of a particular people, what difference does that make? And nations and national borders, what difference does that make? And the traditional family and all the business about sexual propriety and homosexuality. How can I possibly defend this, he says? Every single thing that's politically incorrect is most politically incorrect in Hebrew Scripture. It's like concentrated political incorrectness in one book. And this is supposed to be part of Christianity, which I believe, but how am I supposed to defend it? Now, since that talk, right, without any exaggeration, I have now at this point, 7 years later, I have had hundreds of conversations of this kind. And this description is absolutely correct. We talk about the evangelical world and the Christian world as though it's kind of a bulwark, because for 300 years it's been such a bulwark in supporting the upbuilding of Israel. But those bulwarks are crumbling. Liberal enlightenment is winning. It's winning on every front. And in the Christian world, the Christians barely have, when you talk to Christian leadership from all denominations, and I'm talking about the theologians and the journalists and the pastors and the lay leaders, what they have to say is, we're having trouble keeping our own children Christian. We've lost. We don't know where to go. Can you help us? Now, what happened after that is that I actually began teaching seminars for Christians. The John Templeton Foundation stepped forward and generously put down significant sums to have Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem start teaching biblical theology to Christians. It's true. It's really happened. It's been happening for 6, 7 years now. I want you to understand that this is not the traditional Jewish-Christian dialogue, because we're not exchanging ideas. This isn't the traditional Zionist, come support our country because you believe in the Bible. This is something we've never seen before. Christians coming to Jews and saying, we need to learn Torah from you because we need it. Right now, in the last 3 years, this subterranean phenomenon, which is broad and deep and vast, this subterranean phenomenon of Christians turning to Jews, me and my colleagues were certainly not anywhere near the only ones, turning to Jews in order to learn Torah. This has been backed up by the political explosion that you're all familiar with, which seems like it's not the same thing, but it is a closely related thing. Why? Because in every country in the world where there is an uprising, okay, and I'm not some of these uprisings are more appealing and some of them are less, but in every country in the world where there is an uprising against the destruction that the endless revolution of liberal enlightenment is causing in America, in the UK, across Europe, and in other democratic countries, every single country where there is a political uprising, in those countries, the leadership, some more quickly and some more slowly, but in every single one, the nationalist leadership turns to Israel, turns to the Jews, turns to the Torah, and says, that's our model for what we want to see in our country. Now, I rush to say that I'm not saying that means that you should trust any particular political leader, but you certainly must understand what's happening. That for all of these decades, Jews have sold Israel as a liberal country. And it was never really that liberal. And the more they sold Israel as a liberal country, the more it looked as though, what is this special pleading? If Israel's going to be judged by the standards of liberalism, well, it's not a very good country at all. And what's happening in the world today, in the political world, is that across the entire democratic world, leaders are rising who say, let's judge Israel by the standards of a conservative democracy. We want to have a Christian democracy in Hungary, or we want to have an independent national state, free, in the UK. What are those people saying? They're saying we want a country like Israel. And I'm not saying this. This is what they tell me when I go and visit. We want a country like Israel. And in America, too. Off the record, on the political right in America today, the nationalist right, you ask them who's their hero, at least before Trump, they said, Netanyahu's our hero. Why? Because we want America to be like Israel. And now this is something that we're not going to resolve the consequences of this today. This is something so deep and so confusing and so important, it's going to take us years to unpack and figure out exactly where it is that we stand with respect to each and every one of these nationalist movements, each and one of these national conservative nations and governments which look to Israel and say, like Israel's a conservative democracy, we want to be a conservative democracy. That's a lot of work to do. But I promised you that this was going to be an optimistic talk. For the first time in our lifetimes, Israel isn't simply under siege because of what it is and where it is. For the absolute first time in our lifetimes, we're not just selling, look, we're good at CAT scans, you should be impressed, or look how good our girls look in, Israeli army uniforms. That's what we used to sell. I mean, we're probably still selling it. I'm not saying it's not true, but the point is, for the first time in Israel's history, we have a chance to sell what it is that the prophets of Israel were selling. That the Jews have a model for the way that nations should live, for the way that the world should be organized. A world of independent national states, each allowing the others to live freely. A world of conservative states in which each nation preserves its own traditions and seeks God in its own way. This is an extraordinary moment in our history where we get to speak to the world as the nation of priests, as a nation that has something to teach, as something that people in every country in the world want to learn. Ashrei ha'ayin sherata zot. Blessed, our eyes are blessed that we ever got to see this prophetic moment when nations begin to turn to us and say, what you've got is something that it's something like what we'd like to have. Can you help us? Thank you.